I'm Shane Johnson from University College London. Thank you. And I've got the pleasure of introducing the first speaker of today. I think a point that was discussed yesterday and that Lee touched on this morning is that there are different forms of graffiti or street art, and it's wrong to see it as just one issue. So it's a heterogeneous phenomenon. Thinking about geographers, that's how they see space. They consider how urban environments, including the city, work, and that cities aren't just places that people can move through unconstrained. There are all sorts of factors that affect the way that cities are used by people and how they move through them. And geographers also recognise that different people use the city in different ways. And I think this perspective is particularly important when thinking about things like graffiti. So I'm not going to take up any of the speaker's time. I'm just going to introduce Cameron now. This is Dr. Cameron McAuliffe. He's a lecturer in human geography and urban studies at the University of Western Sydney. And his work includes that on policy research into graffiti management. He's published a series of book chapters and journal articles on social and cultural geography, including a paper published on the use of graffiti walls, which appeared recently in the Journal of Urban Studies. Hand over to Cameron.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you very much. So thank you to Sabina, to Lee, and to Marcus, and also to Lorraine Graham in particular for inviting me to come and talk today. It's great to be here. It's great to be here yesterday. Yes, I'm a geographer, an urban, social and cultural geographer. And I'm a relative newcomer to the scholarly investigations of graffiti and street art, an academic toy, if you will, following in the footsteps of kings and queens of the graffiti corpus, some of whom are here in the room, and to whom I should pay my respects. The reason I bring this up is because when I began researching in this area about 5 or 6 years ago, what immediately struck me was the rise of street art and this thing called legal graffiti. I mean, if we go back to what was being said yesterday, most of the discussion, and if we look back at the work of people like Jeff Farrell and Nancy McDonald, graffiti is by definition illegal. Legal graffiti is a contradiction of terms. So this threw up a whole range of questions for me. I had a brief discussion with Jeff Farrell yesterday where he noted that it was, everything was pumping along yesterday. It was quite interesting because some of the discussions resonated, they resonated back into the past. And so when thinking about the things that were the same as other discussions in other places versus the things that were somewhat new, and where we ended today with that energy in the last session was a great example of how things remain the same. The energy in the room was fuelled by well-rehearsed positions at either end of this dialectic, this polemic between art and crime, what Alison Young called sort of the old version of art versus crime, the version that's about trying to work out where graffiti is in the city. And this argument is not new. But what was new for me yesterday was Adam Cooper from the Greater London Authority. Not just what he had to say, but the fact that he was there at all. The Senior Cultural Policy Officer of the Greater London Authority, and he was asking us to help him understand how graffiti and street art might contribute to the life of the City of London. It's the Adam Coopers of the world that are new, the product of the embrace of cultural planning that has arisen in response to the loss of manufacturing in the economy, the creative economy that's been seen as one of the answers to our sort of post-industrial economic woes. Ben Ine said yesterday that the rise of street art was for him the necessary product of getting older and not being able to take the same risks. The graffiti was boring and the street art gave him a way of progressing to become an artist. This is certainly important, it's something that's borne out in some of the research that I've done. But for me, there's another important factor in the rise of street art, which is tied to the attempts of metropolitan governments and authorities trying to capture the value, to revalue graffiti and street art. And through this, to place or in-place the creative economy in the urban environment. And this is what has interested me in the work that I've been doing on graffiti and street art policies. I mean, this title here, the significance of graffiti and street art in the City of Sydney, it's not my title. It comes from the City of Sydney, who put out a tender for research to try and find out how to work out the significance of street art and graffiti in the City of Sydney. And we answered that tender, got some, we've done some research with it. So in line with today's theme, I'm going to talk about legal graffiti practices and legal graffiti and street art. But in doing so, I'm also going to point to the limits of what I call the regulatory frame in discussions of graffiti and street art. It's my contention that it's not enough to look at graffiti and street art as either legal or illegal. For those of you who are working in enforcement or policy, say at the metropolitan or local authority level, there's a certain utility to seeing graffiti as either legal or illegal. Also, for those involved in graffiti practice, writers, taggers, artists, the legal-illegal threshold plays a role in the distribution of respect, in the way that people see each other through and in the worlds of graffiti practice. There's no doubt that seeing graffiti and street art through a regulatory frame as either legal or illegal has proven very useful for a range of people on both sides of the fence, those who do it and those who seek to regulate its presence in the city. What we could say is this regulatory framing of graffiti helps to make it legible to those these urban, social and technical systems, the graffiti subculture, the law, local government, the police. It's useful to see graffiti and street art as either legal or illegal. But is it enough? What I'm going to do in this talk is try to show first that there is a thing called legal graffiti and street art, and that we need to move beyond the legal-illegal designation if we want to understand the impact of graffiti and street art in the city. I think this is an important thing because we need to understand the impact of graffiti and street art if we're going to bring about productive politics that engages with graffiti practice. So to this end, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to talk about legal graffiti and street art. I'm going to do this by referring to some research I did on legal graffiti walls in Sydney. Next, I want to discuss the value of graffiti and street art. We heard the word value used a bit yesterday. First, Adam Cooper, who said that understanding value was for him at the heart of trying to determine the nature of the contribution of graffiti and street art to the city. He professed that he was thus far ambivalent about the possible contribution of graffiti and street art, and that he was looking for enlightenment. This is great. This is where we should be directing our energies. Alison Young also mentioned the importance of value, that we need to be wary of valuing street art over graffiti, and how this contributes to a hardening of the differentiation between graffiti as illegal and bad versus street art as legal and virtuous. I would point out that the legal-illegal frame is just one way that we value graffiti practice. And if we're to build stronger policy and program engagements with graffiti and street art, we need to account for a broader set of what we can call regimes of value. Finally, I'm going to show how these ideas might be operationalised, it's a perfect word, in urban policy in order to produce a more sensitive politics of graffiti management that better reflects what is actually happening in urban public and private spaces. I'll do this by referring to some research I've been conducting with my colleague Kurt Iveson from the University of Sydney on graffiti and street art policies, working with the City of Sydney. Hopefully where we'll end up at the end of this discussion is that we'll be able to start to discern some of the ways we might progress towards building policies that not only recognise legal graffiti and street art, but go further to incorporate a range of valuations of graffiti and street art in graffiti management policies and programs that inform a more nuanced and productive urban politics. So, legal graffiti. Here's some of this is the City of Sydney. This is the City of Sydney in context. You can see in the middle there, it's downtown. This is the metropolitan area of Sydney. Some of those other places are local authorities or local government areas, we call them, that I've done work in policy with in Sydney. Not all of them. I'll try to tell you which ones they were. So, in terms of legal graffiti, I'm not going to take time here to talk about the rise of the criminalisation of graffiti. That's been done elsewhere, and we've had other people talking about that. But I'll just point to the fact that the increasing criminalisation of graffiti over time derives in part from moral panics based on the sanctity of private property. Indeed, it can be argued that as neoliberal politics took hold in Western nations, property has become more central in a sort of a new individualised welfare state, or welfare-less state. And the disrespect of property has become all the more threatening and has led to more tensions. Ronald Kramer, in his work in 2010, notes that one of the results of the war on graffiti on the New York subways in the late 1980s was that there was a coterie of writers who started to bend their energies towards painting with permission, to borrow from the title of this paper, by seeking out permission from building owners prior to painting. We've expended a lot of energy already in this conference pointing to the privileged position of property rights in discussions of graffiti and street art. I suppose the first thing to note here, when we're talking about legal graffiti, is that permission does not automatically equate to legality. For example, in Sydney, graffiti writers and street artists have fallen foul of specific planning regulations. And if the residential property is within a heritage or conservation zone, then permission is not enough. Pieces that have been painted with permission have been buffed by the city cleaning contractors because the property owner did not seek and receive the necessary permissions from council. Similarly, when businesses seek graffiti writers and street artists to produce signage, these may be subject to removal if they contravene advertising guidelines, just as we heard yesterday. Another type of legal graffiti derives from harm minimisation or harm reduction programs that began to appear in places where moral panics have led to the profusion of zero tolerance programs and blanket criminalisation of graffiti and street art. These usually took the form of what became known as legal graffiti walls, where, in contrast to the wider urban lockdown, people were allowed to practice graffiti. The idea being that this would limit the impact of graffiti on the urban landscape and might even facilitate a little bit of surveillance of youth and graffiti writers and street artists at the same time. These legal walls were, in some ways, an inevitable result of urban authorities realising that zero tolerance was not only expensive, but it didn't actually result in a perfect and clean, orderly city. So I did some work on legal wall program in Parramatta local government area in Sydney. Like Alison, I began my research, Alison Young, who mentioned yesterday, I began my research and didn't know any graffiti writers or street artists. So what I did was go and photograph things. And so I photographed 7 sites, or a total 13 walls, in a legal graffiti program for week to week, for 28 weeks during 2009, producing a visual ethnography that we can look at here. This is just 3 of those walls. It was a narrative of the use of the walls that I wanted to have a look at. So in 2002, Parramatta Council resolved to put a harm reduction program in place, and in 2004 this program began. So it had been running for 5 years. My assumptions, based on my reading of the research, was that these legal walls would be used by inexperienced local writers and taggers. No self-respecting, high-profile writer or artist who those people who thrive on the respect and fame attained through risk-laden behaviours would deign to use a legal wall. Of course, what I found was the contrary. The Parramatta legal walls were well utilised throughout the research by both graffiti novices and the kings and queens of graffiti. Just as Ben I noted yesterday, the increased penalties of doing graffiti, illegal graffiti, have forced people to weigh up the associated risks. The stakes increase and legals become more inviting as senior writers age and take on family and employment responsibilities. So in late 2008, following the election of a zero-tolerance councillor, Parramatta Council adopted a new zero-tolerance attitude towards graffiti to coincide with a review of their graffiti management plan. One result of this was the shift in the politics surrounding graffiti towards a discontinuation of these legal graffiti walls. The council took the position that the legal wall program had failed. Indeed, the primary target of the anti-graffiti push in Parramatta in 2008 and 2009 was the legal walls, with these sites re-signified as the cause of illegal graffiti. Significant local political will was poured into these sites, with signs put up stating that they were it was now illegal to write on these walls and their surrounds. So I see one of those signs there. So the walls were eventually painted over by the council painters who were under pressure to keep the walls clean, producing a cat and mouse game between taggers and the council painters, who were called to buff the ensuing tags from clean walls almost on a daily basis. And so finally, as we edge towards week 28, these highly politicised sites came to the end of their life as they were demolished, marking a symbolic and material end to the legal wall initiative in Parramatta. So what are the 3 things that I took away from this case study? Well, first, I'm a geographer, so place matters. There was a geography that served to differentiate the way each of these walls operated, and so this sort of was destabilising ideas that they all were a problem, that they all operated in the same way. It also connected them into networks of sites in Sydney and beyond. When the walls were knocked down, the older and more experienced writers fell back on their established networks of sites outside this local government area. For example, Spice, here, arguably the highest profile female writer in Sydney, initially contested the police attempting to move her on, or actually successfully moving her on. Now she doesn't do any graffiti in the LGA. Less experienced writers who had cars and often drove large distances to get to legal walls started travelling further afield to find safe spots where they could hone their skills to the point where they could broker their own permission sites. And the taggers, scribblers, the toys, younger and less mobile, they stayed in place, many shifting back to illegal tagging and such practices. So did removing the illegal graffiti wall stop graffiti in Parramatta? No, but certainly got rid of the good graffiti, leaving the so-called bad graffiti behind. Secondly, the thing I found that there was a demand for these walls coming from a range of users. The Guildford Park wall that was at the top of those three walls was located in a park with good sight lines to the railway line and another local busy road. It changed every week. It attracted people locally from across the metropolitan area, interstate and internationally. With people sometimes lined up on the weekends waiting for their turn to roll the wall, paint their piece, step back, take their photograph and walk away whilst the next crew came up and rolled the wall. This showed a shift in emphasis for me, from risk to style, associated with the shift, the availability of vocational pathways, in part facilitated by the presence of discourses around the creative economy and the creative city. I mean, one guy at the Guildford Wall, who was about my age, he confided in me that he was part of the notorious Rebels crew. Now, I don't condone the idea of this graffiti as a gateway crime, baseball bats and all that from yesterday, but the Rebels crew were a bunch of nasty people that sort of operated in the late 1980s and early 90s. And so he'd just come out of jail, and he was there doing a legal war with a mate. So I said, how many people are in the crew? He said, well, you know, it's about 35. I said, well, okay, so what are they doing now? I said, well, you know, half of them are in jail and the other half are architects. And for me, and I'm sure that's not necessarily a mutually exclusive group, but for me that sort of epitomised that idea about art versus crime, but being intimately engaged and people moving between those things and having multiple subjectivities and playing the illegal versus the illegal in their own practice. The third factor was that if we want to understand the contribution of these legal sites, then we need to interrogate the ethics and values tied up in their usage. Moral panics produce value judgments that have real material impacts, in this case in the demolition of legal walls. My position is that we need to engage with these value judgments and unsettle their normative power and assumptions. So I want to talk now about regimes of value. So how do we disentangle questions around the value of graffiti and street art? This has formed a central facet of our current work, with Kurt and myself working with the City of Sydney. Notions of value have helped us to clarify our thinking and to begin to formulate research and policy responses to the challenge of determining the significance of graffiti and street art. I draw here on Tim Creswell's recent work on regimes of value in his current research on Maxwell Street, Chicago. He in turn draws on the work of Ajahn Padurai, who notes that value is a process that is not intrinsic in the object, contesting Kantian ideas. Rather, a regime of value is a localised system of meanings. Value is produced by the passage of things in and out of different regimes of value. The dominant or normative regime of value associated with graffiti and street art is what I'm going to call the legal one. Under the terms of the legal regime of value, graffiti has no value at best and a negative value at its worst. The implications of this legal regime of value become apparent when we look at the way it manifests in regulatory and institutional forms. Anti-graffiti laws and municipal ordinances depend on the determination of whether a particular instance of graffiti or street art is legal or illegal. Further, and now drawing on our work with the City of Sydney, all the policies and systems in place depend on the question of whether it's legal or illegal. But the problem is, that's not the only way we value graffiti and street art. In fact, in our study, We identified over 450 sites of graffiti and street art logged in our survey of the City of Sydney. We estimate that more than 100 pieces exist with the permission of the owner of the building, either negotiated prior to the installation of the graffiti or as a product of its initial unsanctioned application. The contract cleaners have a sophisticated regular audit of the local government area, with the whole LGA reviewed on a 2-day, 4-day or weekly cycle. Yet they leave this graffiti and street art alone. These are the bits of graffiti and street art that resist removal, even in times of explicit zero tolerance. They exist not only in the interstitial and leftover spaces of the city, but also in high-profile locations, where they've seeped into the fabric of local neighbourhoods. Some of these pieces and productions can be traced back more than 20 years to the foundations of graffiti and street art in Sydney. Some of the sites have continued to change over time, but are embedded within graffiti and street art networks as crew walls, where particular groups of writers have negotiated more or less exclusivity over the use of particular spaces. Some of these are the product of funded youth or anti-graffiti programs faded by time, and still others are new, part of the city's program of funded street art that has been ushered in an effort to try and place the creative economy. These are the sites that are not accounted for in the official graffiti policies. They are the ambiguous exceptions that are not party to the normatively dominant legal regimes of value. In order to determine the value of these instances of graffiti, we need to move beyond the legal regime of value and consider other regimes of value. So this is a list of potential other ways, and I haven't put the third column in, but there's a whole list of the corpus of graffiti and street art literature that taps into all of these other ways that we value graffiti and street art. And what triggers transitions between these regimes of value is, in some cases and in many cases, this process of commodification of graffiti and street art, usually done under the terms of this idea of street art. And these transitions are triggered by different groups and different stakeholders. The city is playing a role in this. Local authorities, local government, they are revaluing graffiti in particular ways, whether it be aesthetic, economic or whatever. The community, residents, local neighbours, tourists, the writers themselves, artists, they accord value to particular works for particular reasons. Developers themselves see advantages in investing in graffiti, and we've been referring across yesterday to the idea of street art being tied to gentrification. So shifting the emphasis between these has implications for the way graffiti and street art is commodified or resisted. So now turning to a politics of value. Now, how might we bring this into policy in such a way that we can take account of all these different ways of valuing graffiti and street art? And while doing so, how can we also nurture creativity rather than stifling it? The spectre of the Lord Chamberlain that was invoked by Adam Cooper yesterday. We want to put policies in place that realise the various ways graffiti and street art is valued. But we also want to protect and foment creative practice by allowing space, both sociologically and physically, for subcultural relations to exist and reproduce. Rather than seeking consensus, a more democratic response to this would be to recognise the persistent and ongoing contestations and the contingent nature of any apparent hegemony that results from the workings out of power relations. And in this I'm drawing on the work of Chantal Mouffe, who's going to be talking later about agonistic pluralism. And so we've recommended to the city that they implement a new approach to the politics of engagement around graffiti and street art, rather than relying on the limited legal frame of graffiti management, whereby a single voice of complaint mobilises the processes of removal. We've suggested a number of structural elements that will hopefully provide ways to respond to the multiple regimes of value that we've identified, whilst providing an agonistic platform where resolutions are partial and contingent and provide room for creativity to persist in spite of attempts to regulate it. So we made a bunch of recommendations in a policy report that's gone to City of Sydney Council, that's going to Council in the new year, the first Council meeting in the new year. But I've pulled these four things out in particular. The first is that we want a graffiti and street art register. And it's not an approval mechanism. Okay? This is a way of indicating that a site has permission. It's the minimal conditions. The minimal conditions for inclusion on the register are that the building owner and the writer or artist wish to enter it. Once entered, graffiti removal crews will be notified and they will monitor rather than remove. They will curate rather than clean. The customer service systems we have, for them we're going to introduce a new mapping layer so that when they get a complaint come in, they can reroute it out to the stakeholders and give them a chance to talk to the person who owns the building about their concerns. If complaints hit a threshold, an arbitrary threshold, then these processes of agonistic engagement are then guided back through the council, through processes of community engagement and finalised by a new body, the Graffiti and Street Art Advisory Panel. Regulation is hard. You've got to do things. And the Graffiti and Street Art Advisory Panel is a doing thing that some people might find uncomfortable. It's made up of a range of stakeholders with rotating membership. This panel will review and evaluate contested sites to ensure all regimes of value are taken into consideration in the evolution of particular sites and artworks. The third is a visual data aggregator. What we want to do is we want to collect the images that are already taken. The council rangers, the cleaning contractors, the residents, the neighbours, the tourists, the writers and the artists. They all take photos, they all go into different databases and different social networking systems. We want to build an aggregator. Something that can then allow us to get a range of values collected through the visual medium rather than just negative values coming in through graffiti hotlines. Finally, there's a recognition of places within the city that can be thought of as having the character of a street art milieu, an ambience that recognises the qualitative contribution of graffiti and street art to an area that might help guide the determinations of the advisory panel. And that's our first attempt. But the key part here is, as Kurt always tells me, is to recognise that those have fuzzy boundaries, that they're contingent sites themselves. So in conclusion, through this research we've become enmeshed in processes of evaluation, of policy, but more importantly, of the graffiti and street art itself. Very much involved in clarifying the ambiguities that surround the changing valuations of graffiti and street art in the creative city. You could say our role has been to build the capacity of local government to value graffiti and street art and use this to make decisions, to evaluate whether a particular instance of graffiti or street art might be considered to have no value and be erased, or be recognised as contributing to the life of a city in certain ways that warrant its protection, whether that be passive or active. We were aware from the beginning of this process that there needed to be more clarity in policy, and we could see pathways opening up that might provide ways to theoretically inform new approaches to graffiti and street art. We also saw dangers in our role as experts brought in to provide the necessary gravitas to impose more complex approaches, and the way that our involvement might contribute to stabilising creative processes in public spaces. That the result of better regulation would contribute to the suppression of the types of creativity that we held to be important to the functioning of a healthy public sphere. The acts of surveying, of mapping and regulating threatened to take the disorder out of places, to script places, and thereby shift between regimes of value, the way mapping of street art milieu might precede processes of gentrification. These outcomes of policy research might work to stifle creativity by normalising the presence of graffiti and street art. It's our hope that policies that we suggested that they're imbued with, if they're imbued with agonism, that they might foster contestation rather than suppress them. And this contestation is not between enemies, but between adversaries. Fostering contestation within an agonistic framework will, with any luck, produce the necessary ambiguities within which creativity might continue to flourish, in spite of its commodification and enclosure within the creative economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron, for really interesting and engaging presentation this morning. And if you like what Cameron just said and you want to read more, his paper in Urban Studies does talk about the Street Walks project, which I would encourage you to read about as there's more detail in there. One of the things that I particularly liked about you were talking about this morning essentially relates to broken windows or the signal crafts perspective. So we had yesterday the perspective that what graffiti does is just signal kind of decay in an urban environment. To lots of people, that gives them feelings of fear and unsafety of those environments. What I liked about what you were talking about this morning is the reverse of that, that actually the sort of vibrant, particularly, I guess what you're saying is where these walls are looked after and it's changing, it's dynamic, it suggests actually there's a collective action in an area which is looking after that area, which can lead to gentrification and so on. And I think that's overlooked in the kind of criminological literature typically, and so it's really nice to hear about that. I also liked, because one of the questions I had is, okay, if you're managing graffiti and street art, in some places it's going to be acceptable, it's going to be really nice to see it. So Shoreditch is a classic example in London. I was in Prague recently. For those of you that have been to Prague, you'll notice historic, beautiful city. There's graffiti everywhere on historic buildings, and it's apparently accepted, and it's not something that is seen as a bad thing. I was in Santiago as well recently. I do travel a little bit, which I'm happy to say. And while I was going into the Andes, one of the things that struck me, which I didn't like, was there was graffiti on natural structures, so rocks, trees, and so on. And I didn't see that as particularly as appealing personally. So my question was, how do we sort of work out where it is appropriate? And when I say where it is appropriate, I mean for communities that use these areas, how do you determine what places where it is appropriate, where it shouldn't be appearing, or what forms might appear and so on? But it sounds to me like the register proposal that you've come up with is one way of sort of combating that. And I just wondered if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on how that process might work and whether that's actually been taken forwards, or is this at the stage of a suggestion?
Where, in terms of suggestion, we've been working for a while tightly with the city in terms of what our expectations are and what they would see as an acceptable sort of recommendation that they would action. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about, they want to then fund trials around particularly. But this idea of register, they're definitely on board with that. One of the reasons the council wants to determine the significance is because they constantly get cases coming from the clients saying, what do I do with this? And there's one person in council, and it lands on her desk, and she goes, looks good, we should probably keep that. And whilst that's great, we'd like to make that a more democratic process. And by allowing a register to occur, a register that has the ability to start to build this sort of visual archive, but not just a visual archive. We're looking at ways of broadening the discourse away from the fact that with that illegal idea, the only time you get in touch with council is if you want to complain. We want to build some ways that you can interface with council to give positive views as well. And we want to capture some of the ways that will give us a fuller understanding of what values are being embedded in particular sites. So this is very much a microgeography. And so those street art milieu are neighbourhoods where we see there is sort of a qualitative difference in the way that graffiti manifests. And if you move in there, then you can't turn around and say, there's so much graffiti here, can you get rid of it? Because it preceded you being there, and it has some sense of embedded itself within the fabric of that community. But it's the neighbours and the residents that are actually the test of that. And one site that I didn't talk about that is a neighbouring council, Marrickville Council, is a very well-known site that's become a de facto graffiti street art gallery called May Lane. And it's in the back lanes of a light industrial area that leads down towards the station. And over the last 6-7 years, no, actually a bit longer than that now, 8-9 years, a local business owner sought to curate that area, and it became very well known. People started coming there, international artists were invited in, funding was given, a whole range of things happened, and the local government did a survey of all the people in the local area, and high percentages of people came out saying, look, it's a safer place because of this graffiti. It's a more active place because of this graffiti. And this turns the broken windows on its head. But it's very geographically specific. That guy now no longer curates that site. The site's slightly degraded. Some of the good writers don't go there anymore because everyone goes there because there's less sites around, and so it's kind of going to get And so it's gone into a new phase. People are going, oh, what are we going to do about May Lane? It's like, well, it's changed. So it's no longer what it was. And so the neighbours and the residents are all complaining. Well, okay, look for another site. Okay, don't wrestle over trying to save this one. Look for another site. And down the road there's a master plan of a park, and you can put in a skateboard park there and put legal walls there and pay for someone to curate them on a weekly basis and do something different with May Lane. And so this is this sort of networked idea, the idea that there's all these spaces around. You don't have to worry about singular spaces. You can see it networked within a context of spaces that open up and disappear. This is the ephemerality of street art and graffiti. And so this is the good thing about taking this to council, because we can say, oh, it's all right, because it doesn't stay there. You know, it disappears. And so we're not having this question that happens with heritage, where heritage, means that something gets locked in place by recognition. Here we've got recognition of processes that happen that change, and will change over time, and will move to different places. And it will be necessarily differentiated in urban space. And so if you're in a neighbourhood that doesn't like graffiti, good for you. You'll have ways of telling people that, and graffiti won't be able to gain the same purchase. And all those removal processes are already there.
Excellent. Right. Well, I've been told I have to kick ass in terms of questions and keep us to time. So rather than me asking more questions, which I'll do with Karen after this, I want to open the questions up to the audience. Lorraine.
I want to ask for more clarification. So in Parmesan, when they took back the wall and they painted it white, was that because of spread? Because they argued that by having a legal wall, that what a legal wall causes, it's like at the South Bank, they argue that the South Bank Employers Group have to pay loads of money to clean up all the other groups. Is that why they took it out?
The politics of the legal wall program in Parramatta was ideological in form, but what was deployed was look at the bleeding out of the site. Look at how, I live near this site and all the way down here gets tagged. And so what it wasn't doing, it wasn't, well, in some ways it was, but...
the police exaggerate. Like, what I find is that I've never seen any evidence that, that's concrete evidence that this happens in a specific way. They just say it does. It does.
I mean, I've got photographs of the bleeding around those sites.
Right.
As I say, whenever I'm talking to council, I walk in and I say, well, I'm not here to solve your problem. What I'm here is to say that there's a lot of different people who do graffiti and street art, and there's a whole bunch here who want to do legal stuff. And that means you don't have to remove it, and that means it's going to cost you less. Okay? And so if you want to put a legal wall in, what you need to do is make them have ownership of it. And in cases, there's a case in Sydney and a case in Newcastle nearby, just north of Sydney, where the kids took control of those spaces and they cleaned the peripheral tags as a way of maintaining those spaces. And so you can create ownership and control those things. But bleed happens. I'm not here to tell you how to get rid of graffiti. There's going to be bad graffiti.
The question I have, so you've got an activity support model that could work, which fits with SEPTED, where the kids can clean it themselves. But why do you then need a register? What is the register that you're proposing?
The register is about the fact that, and to make it clear, it's not about authorising a site. It's about recognising a site. And so it's really about bringing the politics into the open. At the moment, we've got a whole lot of policy. So you've got street art being funded at $10,000 a pop in laneways to revitalise them. And then the rest of the funding is removal. Okay? And so we've got these sophisticated removal mechanisms in place. So all the policy and all the funding goes into removal. But what's actually present in the urban space is actually much more ambivalent. We actually see a whole range of things happening in urban space that don't match the policy. So we're seeking to let the policy match what's happening in urban space. So removal stays, but also you have other parts of the policy that says, yes, people do get permission on the sidewalls of houses. And we can do something about that. We can say, let's not clean it. And so they won't get necessarily the same sorts of questions and ambiguities from, say, the cleaning crew ringing up and saying, what do I do? Instead, we build a protocol around what they do to notify people how they can get it onto the register.
I understand, because 5 people ring up and they there's a million people, but they take the voice of 5. But what the problem with the register is, and it's a worry that at the South Bank, the police wanted a register.
Absolutely.
And they wanted a register so that anyone they caught in Southend with a can couldn't say they were on their way to the South Bank. So
legal walls,
how would you avoid that sort of control mechanism?
legal walls in Sydney have suffered that as well. New South Wales, just as the Greater London Authority polices here and the local authorities clean, in our case, New South Wales polices and the local governments clean. And so New South Wales goes zero tolerance. Doesn't cost them anything to say that. We do the policing. And the local authorities are told to spend more money on cleaning. And they go, well, we've been doing this for 20 years. It doesn't work. How about we put a legal wall in place? And then the local area commander will come in from the police and say, no, you can't put a legal wall in there. Our laws won't work because that'll give people an alibi. They'll just say they're going to the legal wall. And so my response to that is, well, that's a problem with the law, not with legal walls. So yes, the police want the register. Yes, the police will want the evidence. But as we heard yesterday, the police have got the evidence already. You know, the police have got sophisticated means for if they wish to pursue people, they will be able to pursue them. There is so much data being collected on graffiti and street art. All the local authorities are urged to join up to a privatised database registers that are collecting data in order to facilitate the sharing of data with police. So all this stuff's there already. This is just a simple register.
Cameron, is it a register of the individuals or of the activity at the site?
It's a register that will say that the minimum stakeholders. So every time a stakeholder, so if you ring up and say, hey, I hate this graffiti down the street, say, oh, thank you. Well, thank you for becoming a stakeholder in the management of this site. We'll put you on as a stakeholder with regards to this. We'll attach you to that site. And if we have an engagement process, we'll be sure to invite you along. So the minimum will be the owner, and if the owner knows the artist, and the artist wants to be on there, the artist, okay, the writer. Now, will all artists want to be on it? No. But if you go on the register, the cleaners won't have this question mark whether it needs to be cleaned or not. Okay? And we've tested these ideas out with a lot of people who have a lot of walls in the city of Sydney. And they seem okay with the idea of protecting it by putting it on a register. And this protection is as I say, it's a passive protection. It's not about protecting it into the future, it's protecting it from above. Okay? It's recognising the permission status.
In relation to, my questions are in relation to graffiti specifically. So, graffiti, in my eyes personally, is a language, and I just wanted to highlight some things, the language used in your presentation. Registers, stakeholders, cleaners becoming curators, advisory panels, acceptable, no value versus value, no value being erased, agendas, and also I just want to highlight that to me personally it sounds like the beginning of a qualification of a culture that is actually about freedom of speech, passion, creativity and imagination. And to me it sounds like the beginning of controlling something that used to be, hopefully will continue to be about expression.
Yeah.
And as Alison talked about yesterday, we users of our space rather than consumers, because you also talked about paying someone to create a space, but then someone paid to come and see graffiti.
Look, there's a few answers to that. In my conclusion, I said I'm aware of the process of modification that I'm involved in. But as I've also said, if we go back to Ben Iron yesterday, Ben Iron is unapologetic about his transition to become an artist. When people practice graffiti and choose to make their own personal narratives and make transitions to become an artist, some people say that they're selling out. I would say they're taking vocational pathways that become available to them to reproduce themselves as an adult in the arts. Now, not everyone wants to do that. What I'm saying is that there's a subset of people that do, and the currently policy doesn't do that. Now, a lot of the words you're pointing to, yes, I work with policy. They're the words you have to use. And again, I'm unapologetic about that. I'm trying to negotiate different realms in the middle. And so I'm trying to do some work that is uncomfortable. And that's okay for me.
In relation to Ben Iron, who I know personally, I remember the Dragon War and all those things he talked about when I was there. And as the I've seen a big difference in how, you know, that area has actually changed. And one way it has changed, it's become a lot more commodified, and that's great for some people, but for certain people in those areas, it isn't so great, because they don't have a voice about what goes on the walls. But also in relation to Ian, I've seen his journey, okay, but as he talked about struggle yesterday, and he talked about he carved his own path, and I think that's the difference. If you carve your own path, or you let someone carve it for you, they will carve it exactly to their agenda.
A lot of the people that I'm talking about who've got these permission walls and have happened for a long time aren't as famous as Ben, but are nevertheless people who've been doing graffiti, you know, some of them since the early 1980s in Sydney. And you know, they're okay with the types of things that we're doing, but they're not all okay with that. And commodification is something that, and often when people ask me questions, they say, oh, you're just involved in helping to commodify this. So, well, you know, the artists are doing it as well. You know, give them some agency. They're doing this process as well. And so we need to step back from some of the simplistic analyses to recognise that people are involved in this process, other people aren't involved in these processes. You don't have to be on the register. You don't have to do work in these particular areas. You can go other places and you can find your other ways of doing this. I'm not saying you have to do these things, but I'm saying that there's some people that are, and that they're unaccounted for currently in the way that graffiti management works.
We've got time for one last question, Joe.
I just want to say that I tend to recoil from policy issues because, as an anarchist, I guess, I tend to see policy as a set of restrictions. What I found fascinating is that, and I wonder if you could say more, it sounds to me like you very intentionally tried to build policies that actually guard flexibility. You know, not that just are flexible, but actually sort of ensure some flexibility as opposed to restricting that. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. When someone complains, you send them out to contest it with the stakeholders. Okay, and this is very much guided by Chantamouf's ideas around agonistic pluralism. Okay, so and I see that as being productive, and so that's what I see as being the key to maintaining the creativity in those spaces, is the constant contestation. And when things settle, as Move says, you know, the hegemony, sort of from the Gramscian ideas, the hegemony that's there is contingent.
Right.
Graffiti is ephemeral. Someone's going to tag it. Something's going to happen. It's going to change. The building owner's going to change. Something's going to happen. It will change. A new hegemony will form. And that might mean that some of those voices who say, I don't want that there, I don't want anything there, might actually succeed in some cases. In other cases, it'll be other visions of what that place can be that are creatively explored. And so that's a key part of this, is changing. We're not looking for consensus. You know, we're not looking for consensus here. It's art. There is no consensus.
It actually, for once, sounds like policy that actually is meant to match the subject of its focus. Where you say the ephemerality of graffiti needs, if we're going to have policies to address it, needs that sort of morphing aspect.
Can I just say one thing? I think the Mayor's office would be interested in this approach. If you heard what he said about busking yesterday, that's exactly what they're doing. And what you know, although I have issues with control, as you can tell, and authority, I need to grow up. But the thing is that I do see that we can get more spaces across London with a system, so that it comes, it's like a double-edged sword. It comes with good things and bad things, but more spaces would be good.
One of the things that's come out of this is they've said, the local authority says, all times you put up graffiti, you need to develop an application. We've actually gone and looked at the regulations, the planning regulations, and actually that's crap. You don't. So we've actually found that even if it's in a heritage and conservation zone, you can do it on the back fence, because it's just paint. Okay? And so it can be interpreted at the local government level that it's not actually development, it's just a minor alteration. And so we've actually said this will open up spaces. By going in and doing this, we've challenged their sort of monolithic ideas around criminality and illegality in the built environment. And so that's been one of the things we've been able to do.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to be a good chair and bring things to a close. Thanks again, Cameron.